This is the Study Buddy Unicorn add-on tutorial. Now the Study Buddy is a versatile backpack that was designed for school-age children, but is also really cool for adults too. Be sure to check out the full introduction video to the Study Buddy, which you can find in the description, along with the links to all the main construction tutorials for this bag pattern. On this video, I'm going to take you through how to sew the unicorn embellishments, and I'm going to take you through it step by step to make this really cute backpack. In the pattern and throughout this tutorial, I will mention the colours used as they are labelled in the templates, but you will see that the pattern comes with a printable colouring sheet so you can create the unicorn that you want before you sew. So this pattern also comes with SVGs, projector files, and of course A4 and letter sized full templates and instructions. Now you must have the base Study Buddy pattern to be able to make this bag. The unicorn add-on alone will not make the full bag. And you can find everything I mentioned in the description below, along with timestamps and links to the other tutorials for the Study Buddy. I cannot wait to see your version. Be sure to share it in the Studio 77 Facebook group or the club group if you are a member. Okay, so as you can see, I have started to cut everything out, and I just wanted to go through a couple of the main points to think about. So you're also going to need, for this unicorn add-on, as we go through this tutorial, you're going to need your pattern piece 1 from the main Study Buddy pattern, which is the top of front, and you're just going to need the outer, and you're going to want to have interfaced it and stabilized it as per the main Study Buddy pattern. If you haven't watched the video for that, do check that out because it goes through all the stabilizer and all the interfacing for each part. You're also going to need pattern piece 2, which is the front of pocket, and we're only going to be working with the outer for our appliques. Again, to put all the pocket together, you're going to be watching the other video and looking at the main instructions for the main Study Buddy. Now the part to the unicorn, which is a little bit more confusing, is the front forelock. And on a note about the pattern piece numbers, so on the main Study Buddy, they are numbered 1 through to 18, I think it is. And on each add-on, we start back again at 1 and continue through. So for the forelock, we have got pattern piece 1, pattern piece 2, pattern piece 3 for the front, and then we have got pattern piece 12 is the back. It's worth noting with all the pattern pieces throughout that your fabric is going to be right side up and your pattern piece right side up, and that is your that is the correct way to cut it. If you have got a pair, of course, you're going to then flip it so that you have got a left and a right. So back to the forelock, we have got lines on the pattern piece. I'm just keeping it attached so I can show you a bit better with the pattern pieces. Pattern piece 1 is on the back, on the back. Then pattern piece 2 lays over, and let me take some of these clips out. It lays over and it lines up with this inside line. Okay, that's why that line goes all the way to the end. So it goes like that. Then we're going to have our pattern piece 3, and that is going to go on the top again, lining up and following that curve. So you're going to end up with that. What that all creates is, if you place it wrong sides together, that shape of pattern piece 12. So if you were to want to sort of lay them out and see how it goes, you can actually lay them with pattern piece 12 wrong side up and lay that on top to check it all goes together. This bit here will be in the seam allowance. So we're going to be stitching around, and it kind of goes with a kick like that and around. So that's why there's this kind of add-on bit so that they stay in the seam allowance. We've then got our, I'll then go through in colour order. So we've then got our back hair, pattern piece 10, and that is our top piece. If I grab the layout sheet, we can see it a bit easier. So we've got our layout sheet. Our pattern piece 10 back of hair goes on top of there. So that's there, that's behind the horn and the forelock and the ears and everything. I'll go through that in a sec. So you can actually lay the pieces on top of this sheet if you want to, just to make sure you've got everything in the right place. So for our green, we've got our back of hair and we've got that right front mane, which is that part here. For our pink colour, and obviously I'm going to be referring it to the colours that I have cut out, but you can choose whatever colours you like. For our pink, we've got our muzzle, pattern piece 9, and we've got our outer ears, and we've got two, we've got 2 pairs. So we've got 2 left and 2 right. Okay, so those are wrong sides together at the moment. We've also got our pattern piece 4, tiny little circle, and that is the middle of our flower. For our white, we have got our horn, which is in pattern piece 8, and then we have got our 2 inner ears, 1 left, 1 right. Also in white, we have got pattern piece 16, 2 of those, and we have got pattern piece 17, 2 of those. In our black, we have got pattern piece 13, which is our outer eye, 2 of those, and we have got pattern piece 17, which is our mouth. And we've also got in green, I missed this one out, but we've got in green, we have got the nostril, and we've got 2 of those, pattern piece 14. It's worth noting, of course, that you could do these in black if you want to, totally up to you. And then the final thing to talk about is pattern piece 5, and this is our flower. And as it says on the pattern piece, it says do not cut out yet. If you are using the SVGs, you can in fact cut these out if you want to ahead of time, because it's going to be super accurate. However, I really recommend, your flower will be slightly smaller if you do that, and I really recommend that you use the pattern piece, cut it out in paper for your SVGs, and then you're going to cut it out of your yellow flower fabric. For my yellow, I'm using gold, so I've cut it out. I've cut 2 squares out of gold. It's like a gold glitter canvas. And we'll get to that for that part, but you want to make sure that it is slightly bigger than the pattern piece, and you're going to have 2 of those. So we're going to pop those to one side for when we get to it. The other thing that we're going to be using, which is not in the main study buddy, is a magnetic clasp. And this is an 18mm magnetic clasp. Obviously you're going to have male and female. That is not in the main study buddy instructions, so you want to think about that. That's only for the unicorn. Okay, so we're going to start off with our front forelock. So for that, I'm going to grab my forelock pieces, the 4 pieces. I'm going to separate my pattern pieces from my fabric. Now, the best way to do this is to use your pattern piece 12, have that wrong side up. Okay, so that's the back of your forelock. Then you're going to lay each piece on top. Now, just like with the main study buddy pattern, I am going to be using a lot of double-sided tape for this. You're going to find it comes in really handy. So I'm just going to lay those on. I'm matching them up so that they align with that top edge and the edges on the outside of pattern piece 12, the back of forelock. And I'm matching them up as best I can, and you will find that they overlap, just like I talked about just now. Pattern piece 1 is first, then 2, then 3. And you'll see that there's around about 5mm or just under 1/4 inch overlap or underlap. I'm then going to grab my double-sided tape and I'm going to place that all along that outside edge. You can use a fabric glue if you want to. I just find it is a bit easier and a bit quicker to use the trusty double-sided tape. You want to make sure that it goes as close as possible to that edge so that it is not showing. And if you are a club member, I do have a full applique tutorial in there. It's around about an hour long with lots of tips and tricks for doing appliques. So do check that out before you get going on this, because you're going to pick up lots of extra tips. Okay, now remember, we are not attaching this to the back, our back piece. We're not attaching pattern piece 1 to pattern piece 12. We are just attaching them to each other. So now I'm going to lay on, make sure that that's nicely lined up. I'm going to lay on our pattern piece 2. Make sure that that is nicely aligned, and repeat the process with the other side, with the right side. Okay, with those stuck together, I'm going to remove my pattern piece 12 and just pop that out the way so that I don't stitch through it. Then I'm going to take it over to the machine and I'm going to stitch along this edge and then this edge. I don't need to start and stop at the bottom. I can just continue going through to keep that all attached. And when I stitch this, I am doing, as with all the appliques, I am doing a 2.5 stitch length on this. Normally with a top stitch we do a 3.5 or 4 stitch length, but because it is applique and we want to get into the finer details, I'm going to be using a smaller stitch. When it comes to the circles, you may want to use a smaller stitch again, but just be careful not to perforate your fabric depending on which fabric you're using. And when we're doing applique, we want to get into the habit of tying off our threads, pulling our threads through to the back and then tying them off. I didn't think about that, I didn't think about the fact, I should say, that I have started in the seam allowance, so I didn't do the cast on or go back and forwards at the beginning, so I've just tied that off. But there we go, that is nicely sewn together. Okay, then I'm going to grab my pattern piece 12 again. Just double check that it fits nicely. There's no reason why it shouldn't do. And we're going to grab our pattern piece for pattern piece 12. And you will see that there is a mark there for our magnetic clasp. So I'm going to grab a stiletto and put a hole through and make a mark where we want our magnet to go. I'm going to use the male side. And the reason for that, you can use either, but the reason for that is that the male has a bit more purchase on it when it sort of clips down onto the bag. So I like to put the male on the outside, but it really isn't a big issue. Now, this is not interfaced on the back. So again, you want to think about what fabric you're using for this as to whether you want to interface this area. You don't have to interface the back of the forelock, but you totally can. And I'm going to add some Decaville Heavy to the back to add a bit more strength and put the keeper on the back as well. And if you want to, you can add a little bit of gaffer tape to the back to keep that extra secure. Next, we're going to grab our forelock and we're going to the one that we just stitched, and we're going to place them right sides together. And I'm going to clip the two around the outside. Then we're going to stitch around the outside and we are leaving open that inside curved edge. And as with everything, we are stitching with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on all our structural seams. Now I'm going to grab some pinking shears and I'm going to cut off around the curves, leaving that seam in the middle because that's our open seam for our turning through, and I'm going to just cut down the seam allowance by half. If you don't have picking shears, you can also just cut little triangles as you go around because we need to be able to ease in that curve for turning. Now, word of warning here, that point is quite tricky to turn through. I'm just going to get rid of any extra seam allowance, so I'm going to chop off at an angle and again at an angle on the sides to help create that nice turn. So one thing to note is that the point of this is quite tricky to turn through. So I'm going to grab a fairly blunt needle and push it under one of the stitches in the end so that it is like that. Then when I turn it through, I can actually feed this through, or before I turn it through, I'm actually going to feed the other thread through the eye of the needle. So you're going to want to have a fairly large eye. And then I'm going to push the needle through the two layers. That's why you want it to be blunt. You don't want to be catching on your fabric. So that it's pointed into the sandwich of the two fabrics so that you can hopefully grab it. Of course, it's wanting to attach to the magnet, which is not super helpful, but trust me, this will help for turning the point out in a second. Okay, now we can get rid of that needle, and we're going to turn the whole thing inside out, or the right way out. So now we've got that thread, and we can gently, you don't want to pull it too much, too strongly. You want to get the magnet through first, actually, before we use that thread. You can gently use that thread as well as pushing to help pull that point out. I'm also going to use a chopstick just to help push that all out as well. This is the point when we can use the thread. So just gently pull, give it a bit of a wiggle, and you're going to get a really nice point. You don't want to pull it too hard, especially if you're not using really strong thread. So you can see that's created a really nice point. I can get rid of that thread, and it is looking good. I'm going to use our chopstick to gently run around the inside of the seam to get the fibres to lie nicely. And there we go. Just going to roll the seam as well to help that lay nice and flat. Okay, now we're going to top stitch around the outside of that front forelock. Now obviously we have got the magnet there, so be really careful that you keep it out of the way. One of my testers had a tip to place some tape over the magnetic clasp. I'm going to try that to help avoid it getting stuck on the feed dogs. I'm also going to use a zipper foot to do the top stitching. Because I'm using a zipper foot, I'm going to use a little bit of silicone oil to help guide the foot around. And this is a little tip from Kim at Cascona Designs. Do check out her beautiful designs. If you love the unicorn study buddy, you're going to love her patterns as well. Now that I've gone through the tricky part, past the tricky part, I'm actually going to change back to my trusty Teflon foot to help me get a nice even stitching for the rest of this part. Notice that I've kept the needle down to try and not have any interference with my stitching. A little bit tricky to get the foot on, but it's going to create a better finish. All right, so our front forelock is ready to go. I'm going to pop that to one side. We're going to come back to that later. Next, we are going to be working on the face. So we're going to need our front of pocket, pattern piece 2 from our main Study Buddy pattern. We're going to need pattern piece 11, pattern piece 9. We're going to need pattern piece 13, pattern piece 14, pattern piece 17, and the 2 whites 16 and 17. Sorry, that's pattern piece 15, the mouth. And you're going to want to use your pattern piece 18 as your template. This has got everything exactly where it needs to go. So one way to do that is to grab a stiletto and at key points just punch through a hole so that you can mark where the edge of your pattern pieces are. So I'm going to make a holes going around on all those pattern pieces. If you are using a stiletto like me, you may want to put a piece of blue tack underneath or some putty underneath so that you don't make too big of a hole. Then we can lay our pattern piece underneath, make sure it is marked, matching up. And to make that easier, I'm going to just chop off the edge on one side. And I'm going to grab my marking tool and I'm just going to pop a mark through on all those holes. I'm using a friction pen so I can get rid of it if I need to. You could use chalk if you want to as well. Quite tricky to see on this cork, I must admit. Okay, I must admit, I'm going to admit defeat with this cork. It is so busy that it's really hard to see. So plan B is to actually cut out these circles so that you can see where they lie a bit easier. With these side shapes, I'm not going to cut out the whole shape. I only need to get a couple of markings, so we don't need to go crazy. We want to try and keep this design page intact as much as possible. So just a few snips here and there to be able to mark through is all that's needed. You're going to also make a mark for a magnet at this point as well. Okay, so I've cut parts of the template out with a scalpel just so that I can bend them up and make marks. Like I said, we want to keep this intact as much as possible. Make sure that's all nicely lined up. And then we can make our marks. And we're going to place on all our parts where needed. And I'm going to be using double-sided tape to keep them in place and then applique them all on just like we did with appliquing on the forelock. We're going to applique them, stitch them all down so that we've got our face. And we're going to of course do them in layers because we have a couple of layers going on. So we've got our black eyes first. And then I'm going to lay on the right mane and the muzzle. So that's our first layer. I'm going to stitch those all in place before I go on to the other components. Now when it comes to this edge here of the front mane, I am basting this because this is going to be caught in the seam. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or around about 6 mm. So I'm basting it just a couple of millimeters, or about 1/8 inch from the edge. When it comes to these shapes, I'm going to start with holding my thread at the back, and I'm going to have a slightly longer thread than normal. I'm going to go round and I'm going to aim to finish in that same hole that I started in. Leave a long thread when I cut off, and then I can pull that through to the back and tie it in a knot. Once tied, you can then either burn the threads, or you can add a little bit of the prim fray check to that knot. And just like with that right front mane, when it comes to the bottom of the muzzle, I can also baste that in place because it's in the seam allowance. Okay, so with that first layer done, we can grab our template again, line everything up, and then we can make our markings for the inner eye parts, the nostrils, and the mouth. Before I stitch, I'm just going to lift up the pieces and gently wipe away the gel pen, being careful that I know exactly where that piece went, to be sure that there is nothing left underneath that's tricky to get to. Okay, so all of the components are then sewn on. I'm going to pop that to one side and we're going to work on the flower. So for the flower, we're going to need pattern piece 4, which is the center of the flower, and pattern piece 5, which is our outside. Now there are, as I mentioned before, a couple of different ways to do this if you have the SVGs. I am going to do it as if you're cutting it out like this, you know, from with scissors. And I have cut out my paper pattern I'm then going to draw around it with a friction pen or a gel pen, and we are drawing around the exact pattern piece so that we can see it on the right side of the fabric. Tricky to see on the camera, but it is there. Right, then we're going to place that on top of our other piece, our other square. And I'm going to pop some double-sided tape in place. We could glue it. And we are going to be stitching on that line we have just drawn. And I'm going to use a 2 stitch length for this because we are going in and out of those curves. Now, I must admit, I've made my life quite tricky with using this fabric. The glitter does not go well on the eyes under the lights that I have here in the studio, but I'm going to now cut across along that line that I drew originally. First of all, I'm going to pull my threads through to the back. Now you can choose whichever side you want to have as the back. If you find that the pen is hard to get off, then you may want to choose the other side as the front. Totally up to you, and based on your stitching and the fabric and marking pen you have used. So now that the flower is done, we're going to grab the front face that we had before, that we just stitched, and we're going to find our flower placement. I'm going to pop a little bit of double-sided on the back so that it is ready. And the main thing to remember here is that you're keeping it quite far out of that seam allowance. So it doesn't matter if it's not perfectly aligned, but you don't want to have too much of an overhang. And of course we don't want it on the eye either. Then we're going to grab our pattern piece 4 and we're going to place that on the inside of the flower. Just notice there's a little bit of hairy on the edge. You can burn the edges as well. Like I say, there's lots of tips and tricks in my applique masterclass, and you can find a link to that within the club in the description below, and how to join the club if you're not a member. Okay, so that's in place. We're then going to stitch around the outside of that middle piece, just like we have with the other appliques. All right, so the final thing to do is to mark on where our magnet's going to go. So again, lay that on top and just check that, oops, I've left my tape on the back. So we're just going to check that that looks good when it's lined up. Yeah, that looks pretty good. All right, so that is the bottom of the unicorn done, the face. So now we're going to move on to the top part. And we're going to start off with our ears, which is pattern piece 6. So we're going to work on one. I'm going to do the whole ear and then you're going to repeat it for the other one. So we're going to grab our pattern piece 7, the front inner ear, and we're going to grab the corresponding one to whichever side you have got facing up, because at the moment we haven't started and we know we need to have a left and a right. I'm going to place it so that it is in the center of the dashed lines, because that's our seam allowance, and we're going to line up that bottom edge. Again, I am going to use some double-sided tape, and you'll note if you're finding it hard to figure out which way up it is, you'll note that on the pattern piece it says this is the left ear, this is the left ear, so you know that it goes on like that rather than like that. Okay, so now we're going to top stitch around that shape. I'm going to grab my other corresponding ear to that pair, and I'm going to place some clips and I'm going to stitch around that outside edge, leaving open that bottom edge. And we're stitching this with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to use my pinking shears again to cut down the seam allowance by half, and then I'm going to turn the ear the right way out. Now at this stage you may think that I've left off a step and not mentioned about top stitching around the edge, but I have purposely left off any top stitching from this shape because it gives a more 3D look. You can of course top stitch if you want to going around the edge, but I am not going to because I want the ears to look more 3D, like I say. And of course we're going to repeat that with the other ear. Final thing for the ears is I'm just going to baste along those bottom edges to keep the layers together. Pop those to one side and the horn as well, and I'm going to grab our top of front pattern piece 1 from the main study buddy. And I'm going to grab pattern piece 10, back of hair, from the unicorn. I'm going to lay it over the top and I'm matching up the bottom edges of both, and I'm going to again tape and then top stitch around that top edge and baste around the sides and that whole bottom edge, bearing in mind that that bottom edge is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just over 1/2 centimetre, so you want to keep within that seam allowance. All right, now we're going to grab our ears and we're going to place them on top, and you can use the template to figure out exactly where to place them. And we're going to baste along that edge to keep them in place. And then we're going to grab the front forelock and we're going to place that in the middle. But before I do that, I'm just going to prep it up with some double-sided tape around that inner edge, the inner raw edge that's not been stitched. Again, we're going to use the template to know exactly where to place it. This is important because we need our magnets to line up when the bag is all stitched together. Then we're finally going to grab our horn, and what you're going to want to do is cut out a little bit of fusible foam to go just inside the horn. Now you don't have to do this, but because we are going over these layers here, by adding the foam it's going to help to kind of avoid any not sharp edges, but obvious edges from the forelock. And I'm going to cut the horn so that it is slightly smaller than the outside, so that it doesn't show, the foam doesn't show. This foam is a sew-in, so I'm just going to add some more tape, yet more tape, to keep it in place. I also know that this vinyl is particularly tricky to get foam to stick to, so I'm not even going to try. Then we're going to use our placement template, and we're going to see where our horn needs to go. Ultimately, it needs to be in the middle, and it's going to be covering up the inside edges of our forelock. And as you may have guessed, I'm going to top stitch around the horn to keep everything in place. That's going to go through the layers of the forelock to keep that in place as well. Now that the horn's in place, if you want to, you can then do these swirly stitch lines. So to get those marked onto the horn, I'm just going to cut along each side a little bit like I did with the face template. I'm not cutting all the way through. If you're not going to reuse this template, then you can cut it all the way through and just place the parts on. Trusty friction pen. Always test your friction pen on a scrap piece of your fabric, because sometimes it doesn't come off and sometimes it comes back in the cold, which is kind of weird. So that's definitely worth noting. So I'm going to start and stop on each line. Again, pull the threads through to the back and tie them off. So with all of your appliques done for your unicorn, you just want to check that the magnet lines up nicely, and there is going to be an overhang. That is meant to be, because we have got seam allowance along that top and that bottom edge. So we want there to be a bit of an overhang so that when you do stitch it all together, it all lays nicely. So then you are going to carry on creating your study buddy by following the steps within the main study pattern and the tutorial if you need it. It's worth noting that you're going to want to keep everything out, really out of those seams when you're stitching around this bottom edge and this edge here with the flower. You want to pull that right the way out of the way and clip it if you can, to keep it out of those seams. You also, because of this bulk here, you may want to use a zipper foot when it comes to stitching your zipper along that edge. Otherwise, you're going to make it up in exactly the same way as the regular study buddy. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. Do let me know in the comments below what you think. Coming up on the screen right now is the main study buddy tutorial if you haven't caught it, and you will find the other add-on patterns when they arrive also in the description too. Thanks so much